26 July 1875. Keswell, Switzerland. A boy is born who will grow up to split the human mind open like a scouting report no one asked for. Carl Gustav Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, would spend decades mapping a truth that the self-help industry still refuses to read. You talk to yourself constantly, every single day, and you're doing it wrong. Here's what nobody tells you in the motivational clips. The voice in your head is not the problem. The way you address it is, Jung saw the entire architecture a century before the neuroscientists got their scanners out, before the gurus sold you their 4-day reprogramming fantasies. The World Health Organization says 1 in 8 people on this planet is living with a mental disorder right now. 280 million of them carry depression. This is not a niche problem. It's a systemic failure. And the fix was buried in a Swiss study room decades before you were born. Stop. Look at the evidence again. Morin's research in 2011 showed self-talk is intimately linked to self-regulation and emotional control. It's not a weird habit, and it's a core psychological system.
Funny how time
But
changes
Brinthaupt and his
things.
colleagues in 2009
I
broke
remember when
self-talk
this face
into
looked so
4 distinct
different.
functions: self-criticism,
But the eyes are
self-reinforcement,
still the same.
self-management, social assessment. And here's the kicker. Almost all mainstream advice only touches one of those 4 lanes. The positive thinking crowd screams, just affirm yourself better. They hand you a mirror and a mantra. Jung never wrote that. That's a fabrication retrofitted to sell books. In fact, the man who founded analytical psychology warned the opposite. He said the unconscious cannot be fooled by surface-level declarations. You stand in front of that mirror repeating, I am confident, while your shadow, the repressed parts of you that run the show from the basement, just laughs. The conscious mind speaks. The unconscious answers in behavior.
Okay.
So the real question is not what you
We
say.
analyze the data.
It's who you're saying it
And
to.
the conclusion is
That pivot
clear.
you just heard,
This is
it's not
the
what you
only
say,
path forward,
it's who you're saying it to.
despite the risks.
That's the structural flaw every self-help playbook missed. Subscribe now because the tactical breakdown of your own mind is just getting started, and you don't want to be the one running the old formation while everyone else adapts. Drop the word shadow in the comments if you've ever felt your own unconscious laughing in the background. Now the real problem starts. Alderson Day and Fernie Ho's review in 2015, published in Psychological Bulletin, confirmed that inner speech is a normal feature of cognition. But its form and frequency vary wildly from person to person. One-size-fits-all advice, the kind that fills podcasts and Instagram captions, is architecturally absurd. You cannot prescribe a single script to a mechanism that operates so differently across individuals. Yet the industry keeps trying. If you've ever felt your inner voice turn into a weapon instead of a guide, you already know the prison it builds. You rehearse failures in the shower. You replay conversations from 3 years ago with better comebacks. You tell yourself you'll start Monday, then shred your own confidence by Wednesday. That's not a discipline problem. That's a communication failure between 2 parts of your psyche that were never introduced properly. Beck's cognitive therapy framework from 1979 understood this decades ago. Maladaptive thoughts drive emotional distress. And if you only change the surface narrative without addressing the underlying belief structure, you're painting over rot. The boards stay weak. The foundation keeps sinking. Jung called this exact dynamic the ego versus the self. The ego thinks it's running the whole operation. The self, the broader center of personality, knows different. And the self is patient. It will wait. It will keep sending signals through that inner voice until you finally stop talking at yourself and start listening. Here's where the narrative breaks. Every major study on this topic lands on the same uncomfortable conclusion. Distanced self-talk and addressing yourself by name or as you instead of collapsing into first-person I produces better emotional regulation. Cross et al. Is 2014, 30 adults, published in Clinical Psychological Science. When people reflected on negative experiences using their own name, the emotional sting lost its grip. The inner dialogue became a conversation instead of an echo. But this is exactly where the internet's version of Jung gets dangerous. Somewhere along the line, someone turned distanced self-talk into talk to your future self in the mirror with affirmations. That is not a documented Jungian practice. It's modern motivation dressing up in a dead psychiatrist's clothing. Jung never prescribed mirror affirmations as a standard therapeutic method, and the idea that you can reprogram your brain in 4 days through positive self-talk? No credible primary source supports that. Transformation is slow. It's integrative. It's uncomfortable. And it requires facing the parts of yourself you've been dodging. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. That's Jung verbatim. And you've done it. You've scrolled instead of sat with the discomfort. You've picked up a new hobby to avoid the quiet. You've convinced yourself that a better job, a better relationship, a better body would finally silence the critic. But the critic doesn't live in your circumstances. It lives in your internal architecture. And it's been running the show from the unconscious, exactly the way Jung mapped it. That critic you've been letting call the plays, it's been setting up in a low block inside your own signal box, and you didn't even know you were the opponent. I'm asking you to subscribe now so we can keep dissecting the internal formation that's been dictating your results. Drop unconscious press in the comments if you felt that counterattack land exactly where you thought you were secure. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That is the founding document of this entire investigation. You think your patterns are just how you are? Your self-sabotage gets labeled as bad luck. Your avoidance gets dressed up as being busy. But every one of those is a choice made by an unexamined part of you that you never formally introduced to the front office. Now, keep in mind what the CDC found in 2023. Over 20% of American adults experienced symptoms of anxiety or depression. 1 in 5. That's not a statistical blip. Yeah, that's a generation running on broken internal software. And here's the brutal part. Most of those people are doing exactly what they were told.
So the one thing they don't tell you about working
They're
from
forcing
home
optimism.
is how
They're repeating
important
mantras
it is
at their
to
own
separate
reflection,
your space.
hoping the shadow gets
This
the
room
memo.
used to be
It doesn't.
a guest
The
bedroom.
shadow isn't listening to your affirmations. It's waiting to be acknowledged. This brings us to the core. Jung's individuation process invites the lifelong psychological development toward greater self-realization and integration demands that you bring the shadow into the conversation, that your ego learns to step aside so the self can steer. And here's the mechanism the gurus missed entirely. Morin's later work in 2018 showed inner speech is strongly associated with self-regulation, planning, and problem-solving, not mood management, not surface comfort. The voice in your head is a management system. But you've been using it like a blunt instrument, cudgel, not scalpel. So what does talking to yourself like this actually look like? It's not a phrase list, it's a structural shift. When you fail, you stop saying, "I'm such an idiot." You say your name. Marcus, that plan didn't work. What did you miss? The distance creates perspective. The perspective creates regulation. Cross proved the mechanism. Jung explained why it works.
Happy to
the
be
self
here
can
today.
finally speak when the ego stops
It's a
drowning it
wonderful
out.
opportunity.
Watch what happens next. Because it rewires everything. The research keeps piling up in 2024. Google Scholar is indexing new work on inner speech across psychology and neuroscience. The academic world is finally catching up to a Swiss psychiatrist who died on June 6, 1961, in Küsnacht, having already mapped this terrain decades earlier. And the people who study this stuff professionally are saying the same thing. Integrate, don't suppress. Dialogue, don't command. Listen, don't just speak. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who the algorithm tells you to be, not who your parents needed you to be, not who your inner critic insists you are. Jung wrote that, and it reads like a mission statement for an internal reboot. But the path to that privilege runs straight through the conversation you've been avoiding. Ask yourself the questions you've been dodging. Why do you talk to yourself the way you would never talk to someone you love? When did you decide your own voice should be the harshest one in the room? And what would happen if you addressed that voice the way you'd address a promising young player who just made a costly mistake on the pitch? Firm, direct, but fundamentally on their side. Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. That's not a metaphor for passive reflection. That's an instruction to turn the spotlight inward and stop flinching. The heart you're afraid to examine is the same one running your self-talk. The vision you want in your career, your relationships, your discipline. It's all downstream of that inner conversation. Your self-talk is the real tactical board. Subscribe and we'll expose the next formation your inner critic has been running without your approval. Comment the one word that voice says when you're on the verge of a breakthrough. That's the data point I need. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. That sentence is your exit ramp from the victim narrative. Every time you catch yourself rehearsing past pain, every time you let old failures define the present tense, you're choosing the identity of the wound instead of the identity of the path. Jung's whole point about the self versus the ego is that you have access to a center that is larger than your history, but you have to be willing to let it speak. The technique, stripped down to its skeleton, works like this. When something goes wrong, you don't spiral in first person. You step back, use your name, and ask what a coach would ask. When the inner critic starts screaming, you don't argue with it or suppress it. You invite it to the table. You ask it what it's protecting you from. That's active imagination. That's acknowledging the shadow without letting it drive. And when you're planning your future, you don't fantasize in vague terms. You use dispassionate, concrete self-instruction, the way Moran described in 2018. You manage yourself like a project you believe in.
Pay attention.
This matters because implementation intention research is blunt. If you just hope to change, statistically,
right here.
You won't. But if you use the inner voice strategically, as a system for self-regulation rather than a tribunal, the whole game flips. The same mouth that once tore you down becomes the instrument of your rebuilding. So here's the decisive take. Talking to yourself positively is not enough. Talking to yourself harshly is a self-inflicted wound. The only self-talk that ever transformed anyone is the one that includes the unconscious.
Look closely.
The one that acknowledges the shadow.
The truth
the one that
the
speaks
light
to the self with the same respect you show a mentor you're desperate to learn from.
This is where the real work begins.
You feel that voice right now. The one reading these words. The one that whispers whether this could actually work for you. That's not your enemy, it's your most underutilized asset, but learning to pick up the line is only the first call. Because there's a reason your mind fights back when you try to change the dialogue. There's a reason the old patterns feel like gravity. And the next layer of this investigation goes even deeper into why your internal resistance is so fierce. And how to outmaneuver it. Who's leading that conversation in your head tonight?